welcome DeAndre and Shawna. I am so happy to have you all here today to have this discussion. I'm going to have DeAndre go ahead and introduce yourself to us, and then Shawna, when he's done, please introduce yourself as well.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Hello, everyone. I am DeAndre Hogan, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Midland Public Schools. Happy to be here.
And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shawna Patterson-Stevens, she, her, hers, Vice President, Chief Diversity Officer at Central Michigan University. Likewise, I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Shawna is a returning guest here. I'm happy to have DeAndre here. You know, I just want to have this conversation about CRT and just to help inform people because I read stuff all the time. I'm looking into this all the time and I see all this dialogue about what CRT is. And I really don't think that people understand what it is. So if we want to kind of just start with, what is it? What does CRT mean?
Well, my opinion is that I think CRT has become shorthand for speaking about race, which that's not what critical race theory is about. Now, there's an acknowledgement of social identity when we're talking about critical theory in general and critical race theory in particular. But I think when we're hearing it discussed in platforms that are related to media or in conversation at school board meetings, for example, I think really what folks are saying is, I don't want you to talk about race, which is different. So broadly, critical race theory just talks about the different ways that race shows up in U.S. infrastructure. So there's an understanding, for instance, that racism is a part of everyday life. Because racism is a part of everyday life and marginalized identities do have interactivity with different mechanisms in U.S. infrastructure, there will be modes of oppression that do show up, like in the criminal justice system, in the education system. And so you want to make sure that you're offering those voices opportunities to emerge. And so something called counter storytelling is a tenet where you want to make sure that marginalized communities and voices have equitable access to sharing their story. I think some people use or misuse, I would say, that term revisionist history instead, because they're coming up against the idea that there might be alternatives to the facts that they thought that they knew, when in reality, it's just, no, we're now telling you the whole picture around U.S. history, for instance. There's also a few other tenets. I can talk about it in a later moment with our time together, but I want to make sure I leave ample opportunity for discussion. And DeAndre, I'm sure you have things to add.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, DeAndre, go ahead. Thank you, Shawna.
Yeah, Shawna shared that beautifully, a lot better than I could have. But, just to add what you touched on as CRT being kind of morphed into, I refer to it as the latest boogeyman from, people that oppose, just thinking back on the language that's being heard in school board meetings and meetings I've been a part of with parents is a theme is, I don't want my white student feeling guilty for being white. That's a common theme I hear among parents that are opposing, CRT, even though, there isn't necessarily a CRT curriculum that we're implementing in the K-12 school system. And as you said, Shawna, I try to share that CRT is a tool to analyze systems and structures within the United States. It analyzes, or it says that racism there's multiple levels of racism, from individual and structural, and how can we unpack that and make sure that we're not perpetuating different stereotypes and different structures that cause harm to marginalized communities.
But a myth that I would like to dispel is there's an understanding, or there's a misconception that one of the tenets is that all white folks are racist. And nowhere in any of the readings will you find that argument to exist. It's very much focused on structure and systems. And like DeAndre said, less on individuals, maybe more on how individuals interact with those systems.
Now, would it be accurate to say, so in the way I've explained it as well, is to a gentleman that, was like, no CRT or banned CRT is, it's not about you, or you play a part in this racial system. I play a part in this racial system. There's times where I've contributed to whatever misconceptions or stereotypes that are out there. Is like we all have a part to play in this. The key is acknowledging that, and then working together to figure out how to change our practices.
Well, I'm really glad that you both. Thank you both. I'm really glad that you both spoke on and touched on the fact that this is not like a set curriculum. CRT is not a new idea. Like, this is not new. So, because people act like this is this new thing, this new wave of wokeism, and it's this idea that being woke is negative because that means that you're acknowledging things that happened in U.S. history, which is very interesting to me. Because I know for myself, I grew up learning parts of history. I had no choice, right? It was just what it was. It didn't matter if I was uncomfortable, if it made me feel bad. None of that. We had to learn it, right? It was in our textbooks, and we got tested on it, graded on it, and we had no choice, right? So it's really interesting that now this whole dialogue of this, where we don't want to acknowledge anything because it'll make someone uncomfortable. Because I have heard, and I want to touch on this, I have heard, people say that I don't want my white child being made to feel bad to be white. And I just find that so interesting. That's the take that people are taking, right, and standing on. Now, I will say this, and I want to say this for the audience, and I know I said it to you all prior, but I know that there are some people that are going to stand on this hill and die on it no matter what, right? So I understand that there's some people that's going to stick with this rhetoric and keep it and hold on to it for dear life. But there are some people who genuinely don't understand it, right? So I'm happy that we're using this opportunity to be able to dispel some myths and some rumors that are going around that aren't true. But I want to get back to the part about my white child feeling bad to be white. Where do we think that came from? I mean, I have ideas on where it came from, but where do you all think that came from?
I think a number of areas. One that I can try to draw a line to is, conversations about race are uncomfortable. Folks are more afraid of being called a racist rather than doing something racist or perpetuating a racist structure. And I think that, trickles down to kids. Again, this is me guessing. I think any talk about, enslavement of people, racist policies, they take it as an indictment of, the white race, or
we've always talked about slavery. Like, this is not a new idea, right? I remember growing up, and that was always the part of like Black history, or even in the history books, that was the Black contribution, was that we were slaves, right? So we've always talked about this. So what is the change now? Is it because what are we talking about more of? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to, that causes people to be upset.
Well, I would also argue that our conversations about slavery in decades past has been very limited and narrow in scope, right? And so I don't even think we have a full understanding of what enslaved peoples went through. So I'll just lay that out there. My interpretation of what's occurring: one, there's fearfulness. I think it's a healthy fear because people feel uncertain, period, right? And they want to feel like they have an understanding of where we're heading as a country, as a society. Where do I fall in that? I think it's a healthy fear that, maybe folks that never had to wonder those questions or think about those questions before are now encountering in ways that marginalized communities have for centuries, right? So I think they're starting to come face to face with some of the things that other communities have always dealt with. So I think that's one. It's interesting that we're talking about CRT because one of the tenets, there are 5, and one of them does speak to interest convergence, which means different systems within U.S. society will come together in moments where the infrastructure is at risk, right? And so we saw a turning point in the last election. Things were done in ways that we had never seen before. They were uncharacteristic with regard to the ways that the election cycles went, the platforms that were used. Some folks like to use the term dog whistling. I choose not to anymore because that harkens a lot of feelings and emotion. But really what happens is in a moment of crisis, when you want to turn the tide, the system itself will work in its benefit to help preserve the status quo. So some of the themes that we're seeing that are not new, some of the issues that are emergent, again, that have always been understood, at least in marginalized communities, is coming to the fore through technology, right? Like we have more access, open access to social media. So various voices have a chance to emerge in ways that we never had access before. The media sites were very limited in scope and accessibility. So yeah, I'm telling my story. It's been there for centuries, but now you come face to face with it. And then on top of that, you have, I would say a democracy that relies on a two-party system. And, some folks weren't happy with the party selection. And so there's like all these different tensions boiling up, I think, in a moment where it's helpful to use racist tactics to run an election or a campaign, or it's helpful to pit marginalized communities. I'm talking about white impoverished folks too, against other marginalized communities, because I want you to focus on each other. So you're not seeing what I'm doing as a governmental structure. You're not recognizing that I might speak to you and some of your issues, but I'm not actually tending to them. And it's easier for me to get you to blame someone else than it is for you to see what I'm doing. So I think it also was magnified in a moment of global crisis, right? Like I want you to pay attention to what other people are doing, because I don't want you to recognize that at the end of the day, we're maybe not tending to the care and concern of our people the ways that we should. That's actually entrance convergence, which is a pillar of critical race theory. And you would want to help people understand how these things come together to the detriment of our society. But it benefits me for you not to recognize that these things exist, that these things manifest in the ways that we govern our society. Because if you start to notice that, then you're going to turn your attention to me, and I don't want that.
Yeah, and I would add I guess, in summation, everything Shawna shared is simply anxiety about shifting social power relations is, I think, where this pushback is coming from. I think these messagings of Black Lives Matter, folks coming together, marginalized groups finding their voice, standing up, calling things out, akin it to the Me Too movement. These social movements like that is putting it in the face of these folks, and I think the status quo is in a bit of a panic mode, and they're clawing and scratching to keep it the status quo, whereas they're feeling the rug being pulled out from under them, I think. And so, we're latching on to things, like I said, I think CRT, as far as schools, is the latest boogeyman that they are trying to point the finger at to rile up a base to go and cause a ruckus at school board meetings and whatnot. So, and pass, and legislation is being passed to attack or prevent this boogeyman that is not necessarily there, but now it's a political stance. Now it's a notch in what folks are running on. This is part of their political campaigns now, because they know it's that trigger word that will get people riled up and out to the polls. So.
Well, DeAndre, I don't mean to get too heady, I promise y'all, but this is a passion area of mine. To your point, even if any historian worth their salt will look at, let's say, the wars that we won as a society, right? And every single war that we won, it came with coalition building. It came with working in concert with some of the folks that you typically wouldn't want to interact with, but we won because of you. And look at the wars that we've lost, or we spent 20, 25 years fighting, right? It was because there was no coalition building, no community engagement. And so if the war is against the ways that we govern, again, and making sure that certain folks still continue to benefit and broadly the masses don't, I want to make sure again that the masses are pitted against each other because I want to maintain my way of life. And I recognize as a historian, as one that looks at wars and warfare, that if I keep them separated, they're not going to come for me. Just plain, that's the plainest way I can explain what I see. And so I'm about building coalition, I'm about building community. And that's actually why I like breaking bread, because you're trying to bring folks together who would not normally share space with one another, with a recognition that at the end of the day, we do have some shared interests here and we need to come together.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that because it's true, right? We share this space, world, our circles, different things. I mean, boardrooms, in the classrooms, and I mean, we share a lot of spaces together, right? So we have to learn how to build some bridges, right? And again, I am not naive or foolish to not understand that there are some people that you just can't build with, right? We get that part. So we kind of we'll deal with them later. I'm talking about the people that genuinely may want to know, right? Or didn't realize, Anna or DeAndre, whoever can talk about this. What are the, because you said this was one of the five, right? Parts of it. What are the five so we understand? Because again, I really believe that they are that the schools want to teach racism and Black power. And I mean, the words they use, I'm like, where did you get this from? So what are these five components of the CRT teaching, if I'm saying that right?
Well, I can do a shorthand.
Sure, sure. Yep.
One is racism is a part of everyday life. One is social constructivism, which means some of the things that we encounter are made up by people, right? So like racism is actually made up,
Right.
gender made up, but it still has a very tangible impact on my lived experience. There's interest convergence, which I kind of talked about in a very passionate way, but basically the systems will work in its best interest at the detriment usually of marginalized communities to maintain itself. So an example would be that's why you see a high number of marginalized communities imprisoned, because they need a prison industrial complex to maneuver and navigate, since we don't have enslaved populations anymore. You still need that layer of individuals to do that kind of labor. I'm just being honest.
Oh no, that's true. And I'm planning on doing a whole show about prison reform and all that stuff too. But no, that's true.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, but that's again that's the interest comes into play where it's in the society's best interest to maintain prisons. Another example, you've been seeing a lot of people be real snarky about corporations celebrating Juneteenth right now in ways that you hadn't seen in the past. Some would argue that it's now in the corporation's best interest to demonstrate that they're welcoming of certain populations and certain cultures, traditions, because there's money to be made. So interest convergence, it plays into some of those things. There's also racial differentiation. Another way of saying this now is intersectional identities, and how all of the layers of your identities come together, one, but then also how those different complexities engage with power, control, and infrastructures, right? Systems. And then the final, again, is counter storytelling. So given all those things that can kind of come together, providing marginalized communities with the platform to share their stories. That's broadly what CRT really is about.
Yeah, giving people a voice. I mean, people who, and it's so interesting too because, people you see people write or you hear them say, well, they've always had a voice. They've always been there. And it's like, it's just very interesting when you try to teach this, how oppression has worked and how racism has worked and how it literally is, within, like you said, all of our structures, right? And when people say, it's of the past or this is something in the past, and I'm like, it's still going on though, right? It just kind of morphs and it looks differently throughout time, but it still has the same foundations, right? So this is always, just very, very interesting for me to listen to people and watch people go on about this, because it's like, take a time, to breathe, man. Listen to yourself, listen to what we're saying, because again, and I like what you touched on too, Shawna, is that marginalized does not always just mean black and brown. Like, people don't understand the scope of this. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit. What is the scope? Who are we trying to make sure I'm saying this right? Who are we trying to reach with the CRT? Is that how I want to say it? Like, the CRT information. Who are these marginalized groups that we're trying to give voices to, or help to be seen more so? Does that make? Am I saying that right? I hope I am, because oftentimes people associate marginalized with black mostly, and then maybe brown, right? But it's deeper than that. It's broader than that. So can we talk on that a little bit?
I could try. I think so. In my role with the school district, as the director of DE&I, yeah, Big Rock definitely, with our black and brown population, making sure that they have voice. We're building agency with those students, as well as LGBTQIA plus folks living with disabilities, invisible or visible disabilities. Socioeconomic status is a big one that isn't talked about. Making sure that we, through our work and through our structures, there aren't any barriers to any of our students. And so that's kind of who I think about in this work, and who I try to, again, remove barriers, review our structures and our systems, and make sure that I'm equipping our staff and our teachers and our administrators to address issues when they arise. And yeah.
Thank you, Shawna. Do you want to add to that? Do you have anything you want to add to that? Thank you, DeAndre.
DeAndre did a great job. I think a few others that we think about, and I know because I actually have conversations with DeAndre about these folks are, folks that are not necessarily represented because of their age, because of their size. Religious pluralism is also a piece that we seem to negate often, or folks that might even identify as agnostic or atheist. There's often some assumptions that folks in the space are Christian, and that's not necessarily the case. So we're talking about minoritized voices across the spectrum, and making sure that we're providing spaces that offer inclusivity across identity, for sure. I think, and DeAndre, you might even have some recommendations. I think for folks that are interested in getting to understand or learn more about these pieces, because yes, it began with critical race theory, but like I said, there's been a boon in terms of critical theory writ large. I think one of the first pieces folks might want to read would be Derek Bell's Faces at the Bottom of the Well. And then for a shorthand version of critical race theory, check out Critical Race Theory 101, or an introduction rather, and that's by Delgado and Stefanchik, and that was written in 2001. And I think they have a second iteration that came out in like 2019, 2010, something like that.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, always are looking for literature to be able to kind of understand a little bit more. I know I do, because I just like to not only just understand it for myself, but how to articulate it and share it with others, right? To build those bridges to help people understand, because both of you all touched on it so wonderfully that it goes across the spectrum, right? These are giving everybody a seat at the table to be able to be seen and heard. It's very simple, right? And so there is a fear, I think, going on right now in our society, in our world, where people feel like they're, either losing power, or it's almost this idea that, that we're trying to teach that people ought to be ashamed to be white. And that's ridiculous, right? I mean, I know I've told plenty of white people, like, I don't want you to be ashamed to be white. Be who you are. I want to be who I am too. That's the whole point. We want to be able to be who we are without that type of judgment, right? So I appreciate what you all said about that. Where did it come from? Like, so, because I'm totally, because I'm one of those people that will tell you I'm a little ignorant to some of it, because I'm not, that's not my expertise, right? So where did it come from? Where did people start hearing this thing where they're teaching CRT? When did it start? I mean, because I know we have the DEI programs that's everywhere now. Even companies are having like people that are coming in, like they brought you in, DeAndre, and saying, "I want you to teach it here at our, corporation, our institution." Where did it start recently? Using that as something to say, they're teaching our children racism. When did it start? I don't. I guess I don't understand.
South Lake, Texas, is a. So I'll share a podcast with you later, but it's a 6-part podcast about the community. If some big racial event happened, and the community responded by putting together committees and working towards a resolution or a constitution towards racial equity, and it's a 2-year process. And so it kind of follows the path of this particular school district, and really the radio or media personality that opposed it kind of latched onto it and started. Folks are attributing the fight against CRT to this media who made the rounds and kind of spread this notion that we're teaching CRT and we're teaching anti-American. So it kind of just caught fire and is now a staunch thing or thing to focus on for folks.
Oh, gotcha. I didn't realize that. Thank you for that. Because I'm like, because all of a sudden I start hearing people going off about this CRT, and I'm saying, why are people upset about this now? It's been a thing, but now, okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so I think a lot of people make assumptions about me and what I'm about and who I am because of the way I look. And I think there might be some assumptions that I don't understand conservative voices or experiences. I want to say this because I'm really transparent about my experiences. I was born and raised in a Republican household. So I am still very much a part of my family the last I checked. So, there might be some assumptions around where I stand politically and whatnot. I want to dispel that because from my perspective, a rose is still a rose. If it wasn't CRT, it would have been something else, but the underlying issue would have been the same. And really, it's trying to keep people, like I said earlier, and I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's true. It's trying to keep people divided. It's trying to keep people fearful. And the effort is meant to make sure that, we are dismantling or making inaccessible the very opportunities that would allow folks to grow, to advance, and to develop. Education is one of those spaces where those things can happen, K through 12 and elsewhere, right? And so some of the conversations you're even seeing around higher education that is becoming more liberal is not becoming more liberal. They're actually one of the most conservative spaces you could enter into. I know because I'm in them all the time. The difference is that we make space for alternative solutions. We make space for various voices. We are mindful about making sure that curricula is diversified. We're mindful to make sure that folks have access, and it's still not where it needs to be. But a rose is still a rose. So if it had not been CRT, the issue would still be manifesting. We would just be focused on another theory instead.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I agree with you both. As someone that's been called a conspiracy theorist, I appreciate what you share because it's not really about being a conspiracy theorist, right? This is just something that is called, for me, being observant, right? When you sit back and you watch how things play out and how things are strategically done, right? This is strategically done. This is not stuff that's like haphazardly happening, right? This is stuff that is strategically done. And when you watch that, you say, oh, wait a minute, that does make sense. If we just kind of keep fighting each other, then we're not paying attention to what's actually going on. How do you all think that we can build some of these bridges around this conversation or this idea?
I think, as you said, continue to build bridges, create space for different views. What we always anchor our discussions to, myself and my colleagues that entertain the folks that come through with concerns is, as a K-12 system, as a school district, every student, can you agree with us that every student deserves, access to opportunities to, to the best resources possible to take advantage of the academics and the social aspects of their schooling? Can you agree with us on that? and usually is a yes. And so to anchor to that, like that's what we're doing. And it looks different for different people. Some conversations are tough to have, but it's important to practice this. And when I work with my teachers as well, is how to have these. Sometimes they're called academic conversations. Sometimes they're called critical conversations in the classroom. Something comes up. We're trying to move I'm trying to move my folks away from being indifferent to tough conversations, or a student says something offensive about another student. Like, instead of being indifferent to that, call it out, turn it into a learning moment, and then move on from there instead of just ignore it, because that student who was targeted by that remark or action, now they're living with that, and now that's
Or
shaping.
they have to carry it. They have to carry it. And
Yeah.
it's like, somebody else needs to help them carry that. And I like what you said. I'm sorry to interject, but this is a passion of mine. When I used to be in the school system and they would do those like broad conversations and say and talk about being nice or being kind to everybody instead of actually targeting in on what happened, right? And just calling it out as it is and actually dealing with that, either that child or those children, and really help them learn. Like you said, use it as a teaching moment instead of using this broad. That drives me nuts. Like when we just say, oh, just be kind. How are we helping them to be kind if we're not explaining that this was the part, that this is what you did that was unkind? So this is how you get to being kind. Like we have to actually talk about these things. And that's the part where, again, it goes back to that being uncomfortable. But I've been uncomfortable a lot of times in my life, right? In different situations that I walked into, just by being a tall Black woman, right? So I mean, we've all been uncomfortable. So sorry to interject on that part, but I just like that. I like that we are calling things out, and you don't have to be aggressive. You don't have to be angry about it, but it needs to be said, right? I mean, it just needs to be said. And so yes. So if you have more to add, go ahead, DeAndre, and then Shawna, if you want to add something as well to that.
That's a great conclusion. That's my input.
I think the final thing I'll add is needing to add a level of persistence in our efforts, and understanding that it will actually call upon a village to get this work done. I think people like to romanticize MLK, for instance, not realizing how many people were working in concert with one another to make sure that he could give the speeches that he gave, to make sure that he engaged in the efforts that he uplifted in different communities. There was a whole effort behind that one person. And so moments when you get tired or disenchanted or weary, you'll have a community behind you to keep you lifted while you're nourishing yourself, that let them take on some of the burden until you are restored. And so I think there needs to be a recognition that it is a community effort, and that there is some persistence required. And in moments when your feelings have been hurt, it's completely okay to acknowledge where you're feeling and sit in that. And then, once you have licked your wounds or reflected or engaged or disengaged, that you're willing to come back and continue. So that I think that is required in terms of making sure that we're successful as a community. And, it's going to take 3 or 4 times with some people sometimes, but again, if they demonstrate, because you said this earlier, they demonstrate a willingness to at least learn and engage, I can work with that, even if it means I'm repeating myself a few times first.
No, I appreciate that. I really do. I appreciate what both of you all do, because and it's so true. It does take a village. I mean, it really does take a community of people from all different backgrounds and experiences to share those experiences, because you guys, I mean, you all really sit in very vulnerable spaces, right? This is not easy for even you all sometimes, right? I mean, people, like you said, and I like how you talked about romanticizing things. Sometimes people look at it like, oh, we just can't wait to get up and talk about our hardships, or things that we've dealt with, or things that we've seen. No, I would prefer not to keep talking about it all the time, right? But I understand that we need to do this to get to where we all collectively need to go, right? And one day I really want to have a discussion about the bootstrap conversation, right? I really want to talk about that. When people say, just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, right? I'm like, some people don't have boots. Can we start there? Some people literally don't have boots. So how do we have that conversation? So I really want to talk about that too, because I think that the more we break down some of these myths or misinformation, it helps. It helps a lot. So again, I appreciate you both for what you do. It's not easy work, but it's necessary work. So I do appreciate the spaces that you guys are both in and that you guys intentionally put yourself into, right? To be able to share these messages and to help us grow as a society. Like you said, we have to kind of get in there and pluck up some of these roots, right? Because right now, as you talked about China earlier, some of this stuff is surface stuff. I mean, like you said, it could have been any name. You guys both touched on that. That is the truth. We're trying to get down to some root issues so that we can grow the way we need to. So again, appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. I would love to continue this conversation. Because it's good. This is good. This is good. Give a little bit at a time. Keep coming back, sharing a little bit more, and hopefully people will grow.